So I know a lot of people are in a place in their life where they're like, God has made me all of these promises and I've been waiting on this for so long. What is happening? My life feels like it's in reverse. It's going backwards. What's going on? Well, whatever God did promise you, it will happen. But understand there is a preparation period. He has to prepare you what it is that he promised you. So there are things that have to be cultivated on the inside of you to make you ready, to prepare you for that promise. Now, let's take a look at Joseph, right? Joseph had a dream when he was 17 years old. He had a vision when he was 17 years old. It did not manifest until he was 30. It took 13 years for the manifestation of that dream. That doesn't mean it's going to take 13 years for you, but whether it happens 6 days from now or 6 months from now or 6 years from now, there is a process that you have to go through, because God's not going to give you the promise if you're not prepared for it. You cannot maintain if you haven't been prepared to stand in that position. So let's look at Joseph. In these 13 years, and it's not the time that I'm trying to focus on here, it's what happened in between the time that he had the vision and the time that the promise manifested. It's important to look at what went on between that. During that time, he was thrown in a pit. He was enslaved. He was falsely accused. He was imprisoned. And then he was elevated and promoted to the palace. And then he was Pharaoh's right-hand man. After all of that, after being in a pit, after being betrayed by family members, after being accused of things you didn't do, after being in prison. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to go to a physical jail, but I know every one of us who has been waiting on a promise, or if you live long enough, at some point in your life, there's a season where it just feels like you're in prison to something, that you're in bondage to something, and you're like, what is going on? I know what I saw. I know what I prayed about. I know what God promised me, but why am I here? Well, sometimes you have to go in the pit before you can get to the palace. Now later, you'll hear me talk on a message. It's called Lies and Fairy Tales, that I wrote, and it's about women and who want to be married or waiting on Prince Charming. One thing that I have always told women who are waiting for their happily ever after, it's not a fairy tale you can pull up for me, at least not a Disney story, where the princess went from the beginning of the story to happily ever after. Every princess had a pit before she got to her happily ever after. It's no different from us. I don't care if we want to talk about cartoons and we want to talk about whether we're going to talk about Jasmine and Aladdin, or if we're going to talk about the Princess Frog, the Princess and the Frog, whatever it's called. You know what I'm talking about. She had to go through a process. She didn't even start out as royalty. She started out, what was she doing? Working. She wanted to own a restaurant, but she started out working. She was turned into something that she wasn't. She was turned into a frog. Now, granted, you're not going to get turned into a literal frog, but she went to a place that was beneath what she was, and she had to go through all of this stuff to get back to the place. And then later her prince came forth, and then she got everything she wanted, but there was still a pitfall. And for us, it's not necessarily a fall as much as it is a pit experience. So we're going to go through a pit experience before we get to the promise. And there are tools that we become aware of. There are lessons that we learn while going through all of those things that are going to be necessary once we get promoted to the palace. You can't stand in the palace and sit in a seat of authority with no knowledge, with no muscle. Joseph had gained muscle while he went through what he went through. You can't be enslaved to something. You can't be working for somebody and not build your muscle. You understand? He was thrown into a pit. So that means he was in a dark place for a moment. He was enslaved. He was in Potiphar's house, which means he had to do some things he might have necessarily not wanted to do, because look where he came from. He had been stripped of his robe, right? And he had to come on as another man's slave. He had to go work in another man's house. And then he was falsely accused, so he was lied on, and then people were after him and chasing him because somebody spoke a false word against him. Then he ends up in the prison. But guess what happened when he was in the prison? He still had God's favor in the prison. Guess what happened while he was in the prison? He met, listen, he met people that were necessary for his elevation while he was in the prison. Who did he met? Remember, he met the baker and the other worker from Pharaoh's palace. Had he not been imprisoned, right, he would have never encountered those men. That man could have never referred Pharaoh to Joseph. Joseph would have never been called into Pharaoh's house. He never would have been given authority. He wouldn't have been able to provide for his family members, his brothers who threw him in the pit. So you understand, sometimes we get in places we don't want to be, but there are divine connections, there are hookups, there are things that happen while we're in the pit, while we're in the prison, while we're in the bondage that are going to be necessary to push us into where we want to go. So don't despise the process. It's not fun. I know it's not fun at all. It's hard, but if it's hard, it's building your muscle, and you will not stay in the pit. You will go from the pit to the palace if you don't give up.